Nuidat, 1967. There was one order that every American Marine got on arrival, and it made absolutely no sense. See an Australian rucksack on the ground? Walk away. Don't ask questions. And whatever you do, don't touch it. Most guys thought it was a joke. Some kind of hazing ritual for the new arrivals. A backpack is a backpack, right? How dangerous could it be? One helicopter crew chief decided to find out. He was a good soldier. Helpful. The kind of guy who'd grab your gear to help you board the bird. So when he saw an exhausted Australian stumbling toward his Huey, uniform black with sweat, he did what any decent man would do. He reached for the strap of the Australian's rucksack to help haul it aboard. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was sharp, cruel, localized. The blast threw him backward onto the metal floor of the helicopter. His hand, the one that had reached out to help, was shattered. Career over. Just like that. The Australian didn't apologize. Didn't show remorse. He simply secured his gear, checked the rigging, and boarded the aircraft as if nothing had happened. Because to him, nothing unusual had happened. The American had violated the rule. The rucksack had done exactly what it was designed to do. From that day forward, American Marines gave those canvas bags a wide berth. The legend spread fast. Stay away from Australian gear. Don't offer to help. Don't get curious. But the question remained. What the hell was inside those packs that required booby traps? 3 weeks earlier, Captain James Whitfield of U.S. Army Intelligence had stepped off a Huey onto Australian territory for the first time. The heat hit him first. Vietnam heat. Physical, heavy, like a wet blanket you couldn't throw off. But it wasn't the heat that made him freeze. It was the smell. It crawled into his nostrils like something alive. Something feral, deeply wrong. His brain screamed at him to recoil, to get away from whatever was producing that stench. Then he saw where it was coming from. 5 men emerged from the tree line at the base perimeter. They wore no recognizable insignia. Their uniforms had faded into strange, mottled hues. Their faces were hidden under layers of grease paint that made them look like creatures from another world. One carried a rucksack that looked like it had been dragged through every swamp in Asia and left to rot. Whitfield, operating on pure reflex, stepped forward to help the exhausted soldier with his load. A steel grip intercepted his arm. An Australian sergeant, name redacted in every official document, looked at Whitfield with eyes that held no warmth, only cold, calculating emptiness. His voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse. Never touch our equipment. What's inside those rucks isn't gear, Captain. It's death wrapped in canvas. Whitfield didn't understand. Not yet. He didn't know why these men looked like hobos. Why they smelled like rotting meat. Why even the Viet Cong feared them more than B-52 strikes. But he was about to get an education that would shatter everything he thought he knew about war. Let's start with the smell. Let's talk about what the average American Marine smelled like in Vietnam. Because this detail, this one thing that sounds almost trivial, is what got men killed. A typical Marine carried standard-issue hygiene supplies. Soap, deodorant, shaving cream, toothpaste, insect repellent. The U.S. Army spent millions making sure their soldiers stayed clean, even in the jungle. Clean soldiers were effective soldiers. That was the doctrine. The Australians looked at this doctrine and called it suicide. Here's why. The Viet Cong could smell Americans from 300 meters away, sometimes farther. Deodorant created scent trails that lingered for hours in humid air. Insect repellent contained compounds detectable at extreme distances. American cigarettes, that distinctive Virginia tobacco, announced patrol positions from a kilometer out. Americans smelled like civilization, like stores and safety and home. And the jungle doesn't smell like that. So the Australians did something that made their allies physically sick. 3 days before a patrol, SAS operators stopped washing entirely. No soap, no deodorant, no toothpaste. They let layers of bacteria and dirt form on their skin until they smelled like the jungle floor itself. They changed their diet. No more Western rations. They ate what the locals ate: rice, dried fish, fermented fish sauce called nuoc mam. That fish sauce? To an unprepared nose, it smells like decomposition, like something died and kept rotting. The Australians didn't just eat it. They marinated themselves in it from the inside out until their sweat smelled exactly like any Vietnamese villager or Viet Cong fighter in the forest. It wasn't just diet. It was biological mimicry. Their equipment got the same treatment. Boots, rifle slings, uniforms, nothing was cleaned with chemicals. Everything was soaked in sweat, mud, and fish sauce until it was impossible to distinguish from rotting vegetation. The result? When American patrols moved through the jungle, nature went silent. Birds fled. Monkeys screamed warnings. The entire ecosystem announced, "Strangers are here." But when the Australians moved, the jungle stayed calm. Birds kept singing. Insects kept droning. Nature accepted them as part of the landscape. They'd become invisible. Not to the eye, to the nose. Captain Whitfield saw the proof with his own eyes. An American patrol, young Marines, tired and careless, stopped for a security halt in a clearing. They dropped their packs, lit cigarettes, complained about the humidity. Standard stuff. They believed they were alone. Then the ground stood up. 4 feet from the nearest Marine's boot, a patch of dead ferns and mud slowly rose into the shape of a man, an Australian SAS operator. He'd been sitting there the entire time, perfectly motionless, while an entire American squad walked within inches of his position. The Marines jumped back, weapons raising in panic. For a split second, genuine fear crossed their faces, because they'd just learned something terrifying. The Australian didn't smell like a human being. He smelled like the forest floor. Their noses had filtered him out as background noise. Rotting vegetation. Nothing to notice. He was invisible not just to their eyes, but to their instincts. The Australian didn't laugh, didn't speak. He simply signaled to his team. One by one, 4 more shapes stood up from the grass around the Americans. The U.S. patrol had been completely surrounded without knowing it. If those 5 men had been Viet Cong, every American would have been dead before they finished their first cigarette. Whitfield watched this demonstration and understood something fundamental. The smell wasn't about hygiene or discipline. It was a cloak of invisibility that allowed these men to exist in spaces where humans shouldn't be able to hide. But that was just the beginning. Because the Australians had weaponized more than just their smell. They'd weaponized their equipment, their patience, their willingness to suffer. And one curious American was about to learn exactly how far that willingness went. Now let's go back to that helicopter crew chief and understand what actually happened. The Australian stumbling toward the Huey wasn't faking exhaustion. He'd been in the jungle for 2 weeks. His uniform was fused to his skin in places where sweat and mud had created organic glue. He could barely walk. The crew chief saw a fellow soldier who needed help. Pure instinct. He reached for the rucksack strap. What he didn't see was the tripwire. The pack had been rigged. A localized charge designed to maim anyone who opened it or moved it incorrectly. The blast was precise, surgical. It shattered his hand and ended his career in a single heartbeat. The sound cut through the rotor noise. Everyone on the landing pad froze. The Australian didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply secured his gear, checked the rigging, and climbed aboard. Because in his mind, the fault was entirely with the American who'd broken the rule. Here's the logic, brutal as it sounds. If an enemy found that rucksack, it had to be a trap. If a stranger touched it, it had to be a threat. There was no room for courtesy. No room for helping hands. The rucksack wasn't just equipment. It was a weapon. From that day forward, the order spread through every American unit. Stay away from Australian gear. Don't offer assistance. Don't get curious. Don't touch. The distance between the two allies grew. Not from anger, but from fear. Because the Americans were starting to understand something uncomfortable. These men weren't just fighting a different war. They'd accepted a level of ruthlessness, that American doctrine couldn't digest. They'd turned everything, their smell, their equipment, even acts of kindness, into potential kill zones. But weaponized gear was nothing compared to what they were willing to do to their own bodies. Operation Leech would prove that. Let's be very clear about what they were about to do, because what follows is going to sound impossible. When Captain Whitfield first heard the mission briefing, he assumed someone was testing his credulity. Nobody stays in a swamp for 3 days. The human body doesn't work that way. He was wrong. The mangrove swamps of Phuoc Tuy Province weren't just water. They were a biological nightmare. A toxic soup of human waste, rotting vegetation, stagnant pools breeding every parasite known to tropical medicine. The water temperature hovered around 30 degrees Celsius, warm enough to accelerate bacterial growth, warm enough that standing still for an hour would leave you covered in feeding leeches. The stench alone, methane, decay, sewage, was enough to trigger vomiting in unprepared men. These 5 Australians were about to live in that environment for 72 hours. The team inserted at dusk, moving through chest-deep water to their position along a known smuggling route. They found their spot, a section where the mangroves created natural concealment and the current was slow enough to avoid constant effort staying in place. Then they submerged up to their chins and simply stopped moving. 72 hours. 3 full days and 3 full nights. No sleep. No conversation. No movement beyond the minimal breathing required to stay alive. To breathe, they used hollow reeds and specially modified snorkels, keeping their heads just inches above the muck. Their bodies floated, supported by the water, but their feet touched the soft bottom, anchoring them in position. To anyone passing more than 5 feet away, they looked like floating logs. Debris. Storm damage. Nothing worth investigating. But let's talk about what was actually happening beneath the surface, because this is where it gets truly horrific. Within the first 6 hours, the leeches found them. These weren't the small leeches you might encounter on a hike. These were tropical varieties, thick as fingers, aggressive, drawn to any source of warmth in the water. They attached to every exposed inch of skin, necks, faces, hands, ears. Anywhere the uniform didn't cover became feeding ground. The operators felt every attachment, the initial bite, the suction beginning, the creature swelling as it fed, growing heavier, more engorged. A single leech might feed for hours, growing from the size of a matchstick to the size of a thumb. Dozens attached to each man, but removing them required movement. Movement created ripples. Ripples could be seen, so they let the creatures feed. You need to understand the discipline this required. The psychological control. Every instinct in the human nervous system screams to remove a parasite feeding on your blood. The sensation is maddening, a constant pulling, sucking pressure that your brain interprets as wrongness demanding immediate action. These men felt it and did nothing. Hour after hour, leech after leech. They had trained their minds to acknowledge pain, file it away, and continue functioning. Pain was information, nothing more. It didn't require response. But the leeches were just the visible problem. After 48 hours in the water, something worse began happening at the cellular level. The medical term is maceration. Whitfield would read about it later in the after-action medical reports, but the clinical language failed to capture the horror. Human skin is designed to be a barrier. In normal conditions, it's tough, resilient. But submerge it in water for extended periods, especially warm, bacteria-laden water, and it begins to break down. The skin on their hands and feet started turning white. Wrinkled at first, like you'd see after a long bath. But this continued far beyond normal. The tissue became soft, swollen. Then it started separating from the muscle underneath. By day 3, their skin was literally sloughing off in gray, wet sheets, peeling away to expose raw flesh underneath. The pain was constant, a burning sensation as nerve endings were exposed to the septic water. Every movement of fingers or toes sent fresh signals screaming through their nervous system, and still they remained motionless. Because they had entered something beyond normal human consciousness. A trance state. A level of mental control that combat psychologists still don't fully understand. They weren't thinking about the mission anymore. They weren't thinking about home or why they were there. They had reduced their existence to the absolute minimum. Breathe, observe, wait. They had stopped being men. They had become patient, predatory instruments, extensions of the swamp itself. On the third night, at approximately 0200 hours, the tax collector's boat approached. The crew had traveled this route dozens of times. They knew these waters. They felt safe. The sampan glided through the moonlight, engine off to avoid noise. 3 crew members paddled with careful, practiced strokes. The tax collector sat in the center, surrounded by waterproof bags containing money and documents. They scanned the banks for American patrols. They watched the tree line for movement. They did everything their training had taught them, but they never looked down at the dark water around their hull. The boat passed within 3 feet of the Australian position. For a moment, nothing happened. The sampan continued forward, crew relaxed, believing they had successfully navigated another crossing. Then the swamp erupted. 5 shapes rose from the water like demons birthed from the deep. Water cascaded off shoulders that were raw, peeling, covered in bloated leeches. There were no gunshots. Gunshots would alert every Viet Cong unit within 2 kilometers. The Australians had made a pact. Cold steel only. What happened next took exactly 4 seconds. Knives flashed in the moonlight. The blades moved with surgical precision, practiced violence executed in absolute silence. The tax collector reached for a weapon he would never draw. His bodyguards turned toward threats they would never face. The crew opened mouths to scream warnings that would never come. In 4 seconds, every person on that boat was neutralized. Some were pulled into the water. Others slumped over the gunnels. The sampan drifted slowly, now carrying only cargo and bodies. The Australians secured the intelligence materials, confirmed no survivors, and began their extraction. 4 seconds of violence. 72 hours of preparation. That was the equation that made them ghosts. When the team finally climbed onto dry land at the extraction point, Captain Whitfield was waiting with the medical officer. What he saw under the harsh lights of the landing zone would become the image that defined his entire understanding of the war. They looked like biological abominations. Their skin hung in tatters from their hands and feet. The tissue underneath was raw, weeping, bleeding from exposure. Hundreds of leech bites covered their bodies, small wounds that refused to clot properly, seeping continuously. They were covered in a gray film of swamp residue that smelled of rot and stagnant death. Their uniforms had fused to their bodies in places where the fabric had been submerged so long it had become part of the organic matter. They shook uncontrollably, not from fear, from the physiological crash as their bodies tried to regulate temperature after 3 days of submersion. But their eyes remained calm, dead calm. Those eyes had seen 72 hours at the edge of human endurance and had simply accepted it as the price of the mission. The medical officer immediately began treatment. Antibiotics, antifungals, careful removal of the remaining leeches. You couldn't just pull them off or the heads would remain embedded and cause infection. The damage assessment was severe. All 5 operators required hospitalization. Skin grafts for some. Weeks of treatment to fight infections that had colonized every wound. But they had accomplished the mission. Whitfield stood there watching the medics work and realized something that would haunt him for decades. These men had weaponized their own suffering. They had turned 72 hours of biological torture into a tactical advantage. They had let parasites feed on them, let their skin decompose, let their bodies begin shutting down, all without making a sound. For what? To kill 4 men in 4 seconds. To seize intelligence that would save Allied lives. To send a message through the Viet Cong network that was simple and absolutely terrifying. You are not safe in the jungle. You are not safe in the water. You are not safe anywhere. The Australians are everywhere. The ghosts are watching. But Whitfield's education wasn't over yet. because what walked through the wire 2 weeks later would show him the final cost of becoming something other than human. 2 weeks later, a patrol emerged from the tree line that made everything Whitfield had seen before seem tame. They'd been in the jungle for 14 consecutive days, operating in a sector American intelligence had classified as a no-go zone. 5 men had departed. 5 shapes now stumbled toward the base perimeter. But Whitfield found himself questioning whether these were the same organisms that had left. They didn't walk like soldiers. They flowed across the ground like liquid shadows. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, with pupils that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their skin had taken on a grayish-green pallor that matched the jungle floor perfectly. Fungal infections covered their hands and feet. One operator still had a leech attached to his neck, bloated to the size of a thumb. He seemed completely unaware of its presence. They smelled like decomposition, like something that had died and decided to keep moving anyway. But what they carried made the physical transformation irrelevant. The patrol leader handed over a satchel containing documents seized from an enemy regimental headquarters. Not a company outpost, a full regimental headquarters defended by over 200 armed soldiers. Penetrated and looted by 5 men who left nothing behind but confusion. American intelligence officers who reviewed the materials initially suspected disinformation. Because the alternative was too fantastic to accept, the patrol had located the headquarters on day 3. For the next 4 days, they observed, mapped guard rotations, waited for the perfect moment. That moment came during a monsoon so intense that visibility dropped to less than 10 meters. They crawled through drainage channels, submerging completely whenever patrols passed overhead. Inside the command bunker, they found the regimental commander working late. He looked up to find an Australian standing 2 meters away, holding a knife in one hand and the officer's own pistol in the other, removed from its holster without waking the aide sleeping nearby. The Australian could have killed him instantly. Instead, he placed a finger to his lips, gathered the documents from the desk, and backed out the same way he'd entered. The officer was left alive deliberately, to spread the story. His career ended 3 months later, but the psychological damage to enemy morale was incalculable. Whitfield attempted to approach the patrol leader as the men were processed through the medical station. The same sergeant who'd warned him on day 1 intercepted him again. "They need time, Captain. Something in them needs to reset before they can function around people." Whitfield asked what happened if they didn't get that time. The sergeant's silence communicated more than any answer could have. The medical reports revealed severe dehydration, malnutrition that had consumed muscle tissue, infections in every wound. One operator had been moving for 3 days with a fractured foot, field splinted with a stick. He hadn't reported the injury because he didn't want to slow the team. Whitfield finally understood what he'd been witnessing. These men had stopped being soldiers. They'd become something the war required, regardless of the cost to themselves. But at what price? It was willingness. Willingness to smell like death, to wait in swamps for 3 days, to become what the war required. The Pentagon had helicopters and artillery. The Australians had will. In the jungles of Vietnam, will proved more lethal. It would take American Special Operations 40 years to finally adopt what the Australians proved in 1967. The lessons learned in Afghanistan and Iraq were available in that filing cabinet the whole time. Whitfield spent the rest of his career teaching those lessons to anyone who would listen. On his desk until the day he retired sat one artifact, an Australian ace of spades given to him by that sergeant at Nui Dat. 4 words were written on the back. Don't touch their packs.